Tonight, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the room become simpler. Let the day loosen its grip. And let the mind do what it secretly loves to do when no one is watching. Follow a thread. Not a loud thread. Not an urgent one. A quiet thread thin as a hair, but strong enough to lead you through centuries. Because there is a strange kind of mystery that does not begin with monsters or secret doors. It begins with something ordinary. A word on a map. A doorway that sits too low. A window that stares out from beneath the sidewalk like a half-buried memory. And the feeling soft, persistent that something about the story we tell ourselves is incomplete. Not wrong in every detail. Not a giant lie. Just incomplete, like a book missing chapters that were removed so carefully that the spine still looks perfect. Tonight, we follow that feeling. We move slowly, gently, as if walking through an old library late at night, when the building itself seems to breathe. And we begin where so many mysteries begin, with paper. Not the paper of letters or novels, but the paper of maps, those calm rectangles of ink and certainty, where the world is held still long enough to be named. Imagine a map spread on a wooden table. The edges are worn. The corners are softened by hands that are long gone. The sea is shaded with delicate lines. Mountains are drawn like small teeth. And across the wide north of Asia, across regions we now divide into different countries and histories, there is a name written large. Not small. Not hidden in a corner. Large enough to dominate the land it claims. A name that feels both familiar and distant, like a word you once knew in childhood and forgot. Tartary, or Great Tartary. Sometimes it is divided into sections. One region called Chinese Tartary, another Russian Tartary, another simply independent Tartary. Sometimes it is written with confidence, sometimes with elegance. But it is there again and again, across decades, across languages, across printing houses that never spoke to each other. And if you have ever seen those old maps, if you have ever studied them the way you study a face, you may have noticed something unsettling. The maps do not treat Tartary like a rumor. They treat it like a place. A place with borders, with roots, with cities. And then quietly, as the 1800s unfold, the word begins to shrink. It slides into footnotes. It becomes smaller, then rarer, then absent. Not gradually like a language evolving, but abruptly like a sign being taken down at night. And in the modern world, the explanation is often simple. Tartary was just a general European term, people say, a label used for many different steppe peoples, not a single empire. That explanation might be true in part. But mysteries are rarely born from one explanation being false. They are born when an explanation feels to need to cover every detail. So tonight we do not demand certainty. We only do what the quiet mind does best. We ask, what else could be going on? What else could that word have been doing on those maps for so long? And why did it disappear in the same century the modern world reshaped itself through industry, through standardization, through rail, through new borders, new textbooks, new official memories? Now, as you listen, you do not need to believe in a hidden empire. You do not need to believe in a grand conspiracy. You only need to notice the pattern of forgetting. Because forgetting is one of the oldest powers in history. Sometimes forgetting is accidental. Sometimes it is the natural fading of things that no longer matter. But sometimes forgetting is engineered. Not always by one villain in a dark room. Often by systems, by incentives, by nations rearranging their stories so their present looks inevitable. A map is not just geography. A map is authority. It says, this is where you are. This is what exists. This is what does not. And when a name is removed, it does not only change the paper, it changes what people think is possible. So let us keep following the thread. Because maps are only the beginning. The second clue is not in ink. It is in stone. Or rather beneath stone. Have you ever walked through an old city and felt something slightly wrong about the ground? Not wrong like danger. Wrong like a sentence with an extra word. A building stands tall, elegant, historic. But the lowest windows are not at eye level. They are cut in half by the pavement. A doorway sits below the street, reached by steps that descend as if entering a basement, yet the doorway is ornate, framed with decoration that seems far too proud for a cellar. Sometimes you see iron grates where windows should be. Sometimes you see arches half submerged, like a face half sunk into water. And you tell yourself the official story. The street level was raised. The city modernized. There was flooding, or rebuilding, or layers of construction. And yes, cities do raise streets. They do rebuild. They do change. But the quiet thread does not let go so easily, because the phenomenon repeats. In different climates, under different governments, across continents, and in many cases the timing when you look closely clusters around the same broad period when old maps begin to change their language. The same centuries when industrial systems spread. Steam, coal, rail, standardized materials, standardized education. And as you notice this repetition, you begin to feel a strange idea forming. What if some of our basements were never meant to be basements? What if, in some places, the first floors were once ground floors and the ground rose, or was raised, in a way that was faster than we admit? It is at this point that the mind becomes vulnerable to dramatic stories. So let us move carefully. There is a popular term in alternative history communities. The mud flood, a hypothesized catastrophe, not of water alone, but of liquefied earth, burying cities rapidly. Sometimes it is presented as global, sometimes as regional, sometimes as natural, sometimes as unnatural. You do not need to accept any of it. But the term itself is less important than the question it points toward. Why do so many old buildings appear partially buried? Why are so many lower levels sealed, repurposed, or forgotten? Why do we find layers of human structure under modern life, like one city built directly on top of another? In some places, we have documented reasons. A fire leads to rebuilding, new codes require raising streets. A flood destroys low areas, new drainage demands elevation. A river is controlled, land is reclaimed, the city shifts upward. And those reasons matter. But then you see another place, and another, and another, and the repetition begins to feel like a language the world is speaking. Not a sentence you can translate fully, but a rhythm you can hear. Layer, cover, rename, continue. And that rhythm brings us to the third clue. Not maps, not buried architecture, but something even more human. Identity. Because if the past is not only stone and ink, if the past is also people, then forgetting must work on people too. Sometimes history changes by destroying buildings. Sometimes it changes by changing the names of those who live around the buildings. A village becomes a district. A people becomes a minority. A culture becomes a regional tradition. A language becomes dialect. And in the modern era, identity can be transformed at scale. By schools, by laws, by paperwork, by adoption, by migration, by censuses that decide what categories exist. Sometimes history does not need to kill a culture to erase it. It only needs to reroute it, to scatter it, to teach it new words for itself until the old words feel embarrassing, dangerous, or simply irrelevant. And once you think of it this way, you begin to see how a large, complex region might be removed without a single dramatic moment. Not destroyed in one day, but reorganized across decades. Not erased with fire alone, but erased with filing cabinets. And then, because the mind loves patterns, you notice something else. In the 1800s, the world does not only industrialize, it standardizes. Time becomes standardized through rail schedules. Measurements become standardized through national systems. Education becomes standardized through national curricula. Maps become standardized through official institutions. And when standardization arrives, local complexity is often simplified. Names that once described broad regions become incorrect. Old classifications become obsolete. And the world becomes easier to administer, which is another way of saying easier to control. So perhaps the disappearance of a word like Tartary is not proof of a hidden empire. Perhaps it is proof of a transition from the old way of describing the world to the modern way. And yet there remains that stubborn question. Why did so many independent mapmakers agree on the word for so long, and then abandon it so quickly? Why does the shift feel synchronized, as if the world collectively decided to stop speaking a certain name? If you want a gentle answer, it may be this. Because modern nations needed clearer borders than old empires did. Old maps often labeled zones rather than states. They described influence, culture, and who lives there more than legal sovereignty. And when modern nation-states matured, the map language changed accordingly. That is plausible. But the thread does not end here. Because the story we are following tonight is not only about the word. It is about the feeling that something else exists, a something under the surface. And this is where the mystery grows deeper and more dreamlike. Because what if the lost civilization is not a single empire at all? What if it is something harder to see? a shared design language, a shared architectural philosophy, a way of building that appears in many places and times and yet feels like it belongs to one mind. Look at certain star-shaped forts, for example, those geometric structures that look like flowers seen from the sky. They exist in multiple countries. They appear in different histories. And yes, military engineers have explanations for their shapes, angles of defense, lines of fire, bastions, walls designed for cannons. That is real. But the quiet, sleepy mind notices another layer. They are too perfect, too symmetrical, too consistent, almost like sacred geometry masquerading as warfare. And then you look at domes. Domes are everywhere from cathedrals to civic halls. And again, we have explanations. Religious symbolism, acoustics, engineering solutions for large spans. All true. But when you stand under some domes, you experience something else. Sound behaves strangely. A whisper travels. A note lingers. A voice seems to glide along the curve. And the thought arises not as a claim, but as a possibility. What if some of these structures were built with sound in mind in a way we have mostly forgotten? Not just to impress, not just to shelter, but to tune space. The modern world tends to think of architecture as static, but older cultures often thought of it as alive, a way to direct wind, light, water, and yes, sound. So here is a calmer, more grounded version of the Tartarian technology idea. Not free energy towers, not sci-fi machines, but a forgotten sophistication in design, acoustic optimization, environmental orientation, resonance effects that were understood intuitively by builders who learned it through tradition rather than textbooks. In that version of the story, what is lost is not an empire. It is a craft memory. And craft memory can disappear easily when factories replace artisans, when standard materials replace local techniques, when speed becomes more important than harmony. And then after that shift, to older buildings can feel impossible. Not because they were impossible, but because our modern habits no longer contain the knowledge to make them feel natural. Now let us take a slow breath here, because the most powerful sleep stories do not insist. They invite. So let us invite another possibility. What if Tartary was a real label for a vast cultural zone, a network of roots, languages, and trade relationships, rather than a centralized empire? Think of the way we say the Silk Road, as if it were one road, when it was actually many. Think of the way we say the West, as if it were one thing. Large labels are not always lies. They are sometimes shortcuts for complexity. In that version, Great Tartary may have meant the vast northern interior of Eurasia, beyond the familiar states, where many peoples lived and moved and traded. And when modern states absorbed those zones, Russia expanding, China consolidating, borders hardening, the label became unnecessary. It faded. And yet if that is the whole story, why does the fading feel like a closing door? Why do some old texts describe cities of unusual splendor? Why do some travelers report architecture that seems ahead of its time? Why do so many legends from steppe and mountain regions speak of forgotten builders, golden ages, cities that vanished? Here, the line between history and folklore becomes soft. But folklore is not useless. Folklore is often what remains when official records are thin. It preserves emotion, not dates. It preserves patterns, not proofs. And patterns are what we are listening for tonight. So let us imagine, not claim, but imagine a world before the modern world decided what counted as progress. A world where some regions favored different priorities. Harmony over speed, durability over novelty, knowledge passed through apprenticeship rather than mass schooling. A world where beauty was not decoration, but function, because beautiful proportions often correspond to stable structures, and stable structures last. In that world, builders would not call their methods technology. They would call it craft, tradition, the way things are done. And then industrial modernity arrives. Not evil, not magical, just relentless. It wants quantity. It wants standardization. It wants measurable output. It builds quickly, and it builds everywhere, but it often forgets how to build with quiet intelligence. And the old world becomes primitive in the modern narrative, not because it was primitive, but because modernity only recognizes itself. This is how historical amnesia happens without a single villain. A new system arrives and rewrites the definition of intelligence. And everything that does not fit becomes myth. Now, in some versions of the Tartary story, there is a dramatic centerpiece. The great expositions, world fairs, are those dazzling temporary cities of white buildings, domes, colonnades, canals. They appear in photographs like dreams made solid. And the official story says many were temporary, made of staff plaster and fiber built quickly, then dismantled. Which is partly true. But the images still feel strange. The scale feels enormous. The ornamentation feels too refined to be temporary. So here is a softer, more realistic thought. World fairs may have been theaters of power, not necessarily covering up a lost empire, but demonstrating who controls the narrative of beauty. They showed the public a manufactured past classical forms, grand domes, and then framed it as modern achievement. The fair told people, this is what progress looks like. Your era is the greatest era. Your nation is the heir to civilization. And then the fair vanished. And what remained was the idea that grandeur belongs to modern authority. In that way, even if there was no secret buried city under the fairgrounds, the psychological effect would be real. Because history is not only what happened. History is what people are taught to feel about what happened. And once people feel that modernity owns grandeur, they stop asking whether grandeur could have existed outside modernity. They stop asking whether other regions, other cultures, other systems had their own sophistication. They stop looking for the quiet technologies, craft, proportion, environmental design that do not come with patents or corporations. And now, as your mind grows more relaxed, we reach the core of the story. Not the empire, not the conspiracy. The core is this. A civilization can disappear in 3 ways. First, by destruction, fire, war, collapse. Second, by burial, natural sediment, rebuilding, the stacking of cities across time. Third, by renaming, because renaming is the gentlest violence. When you rename something, you do not have to break it. You only have to change what people call it. A palace becomes later architecture. A fort becomes regional military design. A cultural zone becomes empty land. A people becomes just tribes. And once the new names take hold, the old reality becomes unthinkable. This is why the Tartary story fascinates people. Because it is less about whether a giant empire truly ruled half the world and more about whether modern history has blind spots wide enough to swallow whole traditions. Whether our confidence is sometimes just a smooth surface laid over uneven ground. And the metaphor becomes physical again. Because we are literally walking on layers. In many cities, the ground beneath you is not natural soil. It is fill. It is rubble. It is compressed history. A sidewalk is sometimes a lid. And beneath it, older streets sleep, older doorways, older windows, older intentions. It is not supernatural. It is urban time. And yet it feels like something else. Like a secret. Because when you stand above a sealed archway that once opened to life, but when you realize that an entire level of a city can be hidden and still be called normal, you understand how easily a culture could be hidden too. Not by magic, by layers, by paperwork, by time. Now, let us drift into a final, deeper layer of the story, the layer that always makes people feel the most haunted. Because architecture can be buried, and maps can be rewritten, but people continue. They carry something forward even when they do not know they are carrying it. Family habits, ways of speaking, unexplained traditions, faces that resemble old faces. And sometimes when history is reorganized, people are moved, resettled, absorbed. And if you want the most unsettling thought of all, it is this. You can erase a civilization without killing everyone in it. You can erase it by making its children belong to someone else. By teaching them different names for themselves. By removing the old language from their mouths, gently, like a lullaby replaced. This is not unique to any one region. It has happened many times in many places. It is one of the quiet crimes of modernity. The belief that identity is something you can replace for the sake of order. And so, in the dreamlike version of the Tartary mystery, the question becomes human. If there was a vast cultural zone once labeled Tartary, what happened to the people within it as the modern world decided new borders and new narratives? The answer, most likely, is complicated. Some became citizens of expanding states. Some were categorized differently. Some languages were pressured. Some traditions were rebranded as folklore. Some histories became local stories rather than national pride. And in that sense, Tartary did not vanish like a city sinking into mud. It vanished like a word that no longer had a place in official speech. But words matter. Because words are the handles we use to hold memory. Take away the handle and the memory slips. So perhaps, in the end, Tartary is not a lost empire under the ground. Perhaps it is a lost framework for seeing the world. A way of acknowledging broad cultural zones without forcing them into modern categories. A way of admitting that history is messier than textbooks like to be. And if that is true, then the mystery becomes softer and more meaningful. Not what secret empire ruled everything, but what complexity did we simplify away? Not who destroyed the truth, but what did modern systems choose not to remember? And now, because this is a sleep story, we let the thread become more poetic. Imagine walking at night through a modern city. The street lights glow. The noise is distant, softened. You pass a building with a row of windows half buried beneath the pavement. You pause. You imagine what those windows once saw: horses, carts, footsteps, conversations, the daily life of another street level. You place your hand on the stone. The stone is cold. It does not tell you dates. It does not argue, but it holds a quiet fact. This place has been lived in more than one way, and that is true everywhere on Earth. We live on layers of each other. We build new worlds on top of old ones. We rename what we inherit until it feels like we made it ourselves. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, the old layer still hums. Not with a magical frequency, with the simple vibration of endurance, with the stubbornness of stone, with the quiet insistence of patterns. If you are the kind of person who cannot stop thinking about Tartary, it might not be because you are chasing a conspiracy. It might be because your mind senses a larger truth. That history is not a straight line. That civilization is not a single ladder. That knowledge can be lost without the world noticing, or not because it was impossible, but because it did not match the new definition of progress. And perhaps, just perhaps, the most important part of the story is not the empire. It is the invitation. The invitation to look at what is under your feet. To look at old maps with fresh eyes. To walk through a city and notice the buried doors, the half-hidden arches. To understand that official stories are often simplified stories, and that simplification can feel like comfort until you notice what it leaves out. But you do not have to solve the mystery tonight. You do not have to decide whether Tartary was an empire, a region, a label, or a myth. You only have to let the question exist quietly, because some questions are not meant to be answered quickly. Some are meant to soften the mind and to widen it, to make you more aware of how strange and layered the world really is. And as your breathing slows, imagine the world as a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over again, each new text scratching over the previous one, but never fully erasing it. Under the modern ink, the older ink remains. Under the modern street, the older street remains. Under the modern story, the older story remains. And if you could, just for a moment, peel back the surface, not with violence, not with fear, but with gentle curiosity, you might see that the past is not gone. It is simply sleeping, like you. And in that sleep, it keeps its shapes. The curves of domes, the geometry of forts, the old names on old maps, the quiet persistence of things that were built to last. So let your mind drift now. Let the question fade into the background like soft rain. And if you dream tonight, perhaps you will dream of a library, a worn atlas open to a page where a forgotten name still stretches across the land, not as a claim, but as a whisper. Remember that the world is deeper than the surface. Remember that history is layered. Remember that silence is sometimes where the real story waits. And with that thought, a gentle, slow, unhurried few can let go. Let the maps close. Let the streets become quiet. Let the buried doors remain buried for now. The world will still be there tomorrow, and the mystery will still be patient. Just like stone, just like sleep, sounds retreat, thoughts lose their sharp edges, and the mind, freed from urgency, begins to wander again, not forward, but downward. Because there is a kind of knowing that only appears when we stop trying to prove things. A knowing that does not demand answers, but senses connections. In the first part of this journey, we followed maps, buried streets, forgotten names, and the quiet architecture of forgetting. Now, we move deeper, not outward into geography, but inward into memory, inheritance, and the way history continues to live even when it has no official name. Because civilizations do not truly die when buildings fall. They die when their memory loses a place to live. And memory, unlike stone, does not need walls. It lives in habits, in proportions, in the way people build, move, listen, and feel at home in a space. Long before writing became widespread, before paper carried authority, human knowledge lived in bodies. In hands that knew how much pressure to apply to stone. In ears that recognized when a space sounded right. In eyes trained to see harmony without measuring tools. This kind of knowledge does not announce itself. It does not shout its brilliance. It survives quietly, passed from master to apprentice, from generation to generation, until something interrupts the chain. And interruption does not have to be violent. Sometimes it is administrative. When a region is reorganized. When borders harden. When languages are discouraged. When traditions are reclassified as superstition or folklore. What was once knowledge becomes curiosity. What was once normal becomes mysterious. And what was once alive becomes ancient. This is how the past becomes alien. Not because it was primitive, but because it belonged to a different logic. A logic that modern systems no longer recognize as valid. And here, the idea of Tartary changes shape. It no longer needs to be imagined as a single empire with a throne and a capital. Instead, imagine it as a continuum, a vast zone of shared understanding, a region where similar building principles appeared again and again, not because of central control, but because of shared solutions to shared conditions. Wide skies, extreme temperatures, open landscapes, seasonal movement. In such environments, efficiency is not about speed. It is about endurance. And endurance favors certain geometries. Curves over angles. Mass over fragility. Proportion over decoration. When you build for centuries, not decades, you learn what survives. And when survival is your teacher, you stop wasting effort. This is why so many old structures feel strangely right. Not ornate for vanity's sake. Not massive for intimidation. But balanced. As if they were listening to the land before deciding where to stand. Modern architecture often imposes itself. Older architecture often negotiated. It asked the ground, "How will you move?" It asked the wind, "How will you pass?" It asked sound, "Where will you go?" And this is where the idea of resonance quietly returns. Not as fantasy, not as free energy myth, but as awareness. Sound is not decoration. Sound is information. Every space has a voice, whether we acknowledge it or not. When you clap your hands in a room and listen to how long the echo lasts, you are hearing geometry. When a whisper travels along a curved wall, you are hearing mathematics made physical. And when ancient builders shaped domes, apses, arches, and chambers, they were not guessing. They were responding. They were tuning space the way a musician tunes an instrument, by feel, by repetition, by accumulated experience. No equations were needed because the body itself was the measuring device. If a space amplified speech without strain, it was good. If it allowed chanting to settle the mind, it was good. If it carried sound evenly so no voice dominated another, it was very good. And this matters more than we usually admit. Because sound affects emotion, emotion affects memory, and memory affects culture. A civilization that builds spaces which calm, unify, and resonate with the human nervous system will feel fundamentally different from one that builds spaces that echo harshly or deaden sound entirely. Now imagine such a culture spread across a vast region, not unified by politics, but by practice. A shared architectural instinct. A shared respect for proportion. A shared sense that buildings were not objects, but participants. Then imagine what happens when that world encounters industrial modernity. Factories arrive. Speed replaces patience. Standard materials replace local stone. Angles replace curves because angles are easier to mass produce. Sound is no longer considered only load, cost, and efficiency. Spaces become louder, harsher, more chaotic. And slowly, people adapt. They forget that buildings can feel different. They forget that silence can be designed. They forget that harmony is not decorative, it is functional. At this point, the old structures begin to seem strange. Their proportions feel excessive. Their details feel unnecessary. Their endurance feels suspicious. And so they are reinterpreted, reassigned, renamed. A building that does not fit modern logic must belong to a different time. A time that is safely distant. A time that does not challenge present assumptions. This is how misattribution becomes comfortable. Not because someone lies, but because the truth would require rethinking what progress means. And that is exhausting. So the story simplifies. Now let us return, briefly, to the ground beneath us. Because buried architecture is not only about catastrophe, it is also about convenience. When a city grows quickly, it is often easier to build over than to remove. Clearing rubble takes time. Excavating old foundations costs money. But filling and leveling is fast. And so, after fires, floods, or economic shifts, entire layers can be sealed away. Not hidden out of malice. Hidden because the future is impatient. And once a layer is sealed, its context disappears. Future generations walk above it without knowing what was lost, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary to explain. This is how the world becomes vertical without noticing. History stacked like sediment. And when enough stacking occurs, the lower layers no longer feel real. They feel theoretical. And then the mind makes a leap. If these structures were buried, perhaps the people who built them were something else. And here we must be careful, because the human mind loves to turn unfamiliar skill into myth. Giants, gods, lost races. But the truth is often quieter. The builders were human. They were simply trained differently. They lived in a world where attention was not fragmented, where craftsmanship was not rushed, where knowledge was embodied, not outsourced. They were not superior beings. They were patient beings. And patience creates results that later generations find hard to believe. Now let us turn to one of the most unsettling aspects of historical forgetting. Not buildings, not maps, but children. Because nothing reshapes memory faster than changing who raises the next generation. Throughout history, when societies expand or reorganize, children are often moved. Sometimes for protection, sometimes for labor, sometimes for assimilation. Names are changed. Languages are replaced. Customs fade. And this does not require cruelty to succeed. It only requires time. One generation forgets half. The next forgets almost everything. And by the third, the old world feels like fiction. This is why stories of displaced children carry such emotional weight. They represent not just personal loss, but cultural interruption. A break in transmission. And when people sense this pattern, or when they notice that architectural erasure, cartographic renaming, and population movement all cluster in the same centuries, they begin to feel something deeper than curiosity. They feel grief, not for a specific empire, but for a mode of being that no longer has a voice. And grief, when unacknowledged, often becomes myth. Because myth is how emotion survives when facts are incomplete. So when people speak of Tartary with reverence or suspicion, they may not be talking about geopolitics at all. They may be mourning the disappearance of a way of building slowly, a way of listening to space, a way of existing without constant acceleration, and the modern world does not know how to mourn that. It only knows how to label it irrational. But the body remembers. The body feels calmer in old stone buildings. The voice feels different under domes. The nervous system responds to proportion even when the mind does not understand why. This is not mysticism. It is biology. Human perception evolved in environments where sound, light, and enclosure mattered deeply. When architecture aligns with that evolution, it feels nourishing. When it ignores it, people adapt, but at a cost. And so, the story of Tartary becomes a mirror. Not a claim about the past, but a question about the present. What did we trade for speed? What did we bury for convenience? What knowledge did we decide was unnecessary because it could not be monetized easily? And now, as the night grows heavier, these questions no longer demand answers. They simply exist. Like low-frequency sound you cannot quite hear, but feel. And that is where this part of the journey rests. Not in certainty, but in awareness. You do not need to believe in a hidden empire. You only need to recognize that forgetting is powerful, that simplification has consequences, and that beneath the modern world, in stone, in sound, in inherited instinct, and there are traces of ways of living that were not defeated, only outpaced. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine this: a city at night, modern lights above, and beneath them quietly, patiently older foundations holding everything up. They do not demand recognition. They do not ask to be restored. They simply remain. And perhaps that is enough. Let your breathing slow. Let the questions soften. Let the world rest on its layers. History does not need you to solve it tonight. It only asks that you listen. And listening, sometimes, is the deepest form of remembering. Sleep now. The stones will keep the rest of the story. As the night stretches on, time begins to lose its sharp borders. Minutes feel softer. Seconds dissolve into one another. And the mind, no longer anchored to clocks or urgency, begins to move the way it was meant to move slowly, intuitively, almost instinctively. This is where deeper stories live. Not in loud declarations, not in sudden revelations, but in long, unbroken lines of thought that feel more like remembering than learning. Earlier, we spoke of architecture, of sound, of forgotten methods, and quiet design languages that once shaped entire regions without needing names or flags. Now, let us step even further inward. Because beneath stone, beneath maps, beneath cities themselves, there is something even more persistent. Human pattern. The way people repeat certain behaviors across time, even when they no longer know why. Every civilization leaves behind two kinds of traces. The first is obvious. Buildings, tools, written records. The second is subtle. Preferences, instincts, unconscious choices that survive even when the explanation is gone. And it is this second trace that often lasts the longest. Consider this. Across vast regions of Eurasia, from Central Asia through parts of Eastern Europe and into Siberia, certain architectural tendencies appear again and again. Large, symmetrical layouts, strong central axes, radial designs that draw attention inward, toward a center. These choices are not random. They appear in sacred spaces, in civic spaces, in places meant for gathering, for decision-making, for ceremony. And they appear even in cultures that, according to official history, had little direct contact. This does not require a single empire to explain. It requires something quieter. Shared inheritance. Knowledge moving along trade routes, marriages, seasonal migrations. Ideas traveling faster than armies. In pre-industrial worlds, knowledge did not belong to institutions. It belonged to people, to families, to guilds, to lineages of builders and craftsmen, and those lineages could cross borders without ever appearing on a map. So when modern historians look back and ask, who built this? They often look for a government. But older worlds did not always work that way. They worked through continuity, through repetition, through a kind of cultural muscle memory. This is why some structures feel strangely familiar even when we cannot place them. The body recognizes the logic before the mind does. And now let us consider another layer, one that often goes unnoticed. Silence. Modern life is loud. Even at night, there is a hum. Electricity, engines, distant traffic, data moving invisibly through the air. Silence has become rare. But many older structures seem designed for silence. Not emptiness, but a particular kind of quiet, one that amplifies internal awareness. Thick stone walls that block outside noise. High ceilings that allow sound to rise and disperse. Materials that soften echoes rather than sharpen them. This is not accidental. Silence has always been associated with reflection, with focus, with altered states of consciousness. Monasteries understood this. Temples understood this. Even ancient civic halls understood this. A quiet space changes how people think. It slows speech. It deepens attention. It discourages chaos. Now imagine a civilization or a cultural zone that valued this effect. A world that built not to overwhelm, but to settle. Such a world would feel alien to modern systems built around stimulation and constant engagement. And when modern observers encounter its remnants, they might misunderstand them completely, calling them ceremonial, calling them symbolic, calling them excessive, never suspecting that they were functional on a psychological level. This is where the idea of lost knowledge becomes meaningful without becoming fantastical. Not lost machines, lost priorities, lost understanding of how environment shapes mind. And now, let us return again to the earth. Because beneath cities, beneath sealed streets, there is not only architecture, there is also time compressed. When a layer is buried quickly, whether by disaster, reconstruction, or deliberate leveling, it preserves a moment, a frozen pause. And when people later rediscover such layers, they often feel disoriented. The past feels closer than it should. The craftsmanship feels too advanced. The timelines feel wrong. This creates discomfort, and discomfort seeks resolution. Modern history often resolves this discomfort by stretching time, by saying, "This must have taken centuries." But sometimes, the evidence suggests speed. Sometimes structures appear to have been built faster than official methods allow. Not because the builders were superhuman, but because they were organized differently. because their entire society was oriented around building as a primary activity, not a specialized industry. In such worlds, thousands of skilled hands could work simultaneously, guided by shared tradition rather than centralized blueprints. Speed, in that context, does not require machines. It requires coordination. And coordination is easiest when everyone already knows what to do. This is why certain historical construction timelines feel unbelievable to modern minds. We imagine construction as disruption. They experienced it as rhythm. Now let us turn to a more intimate trace of the past. The human nervous system. Recent research quietly, without sensational headlines, has begun to show something interesting. Different populations exhibit subtle differences in sensitivity to sound, light, altitude, and electromagnetic variation. Not supernatural sensitivity. Biological variation. Adaptation. People who lived for millennia in wide-open spaces develop different perceptual habits than those who lived in forests or enclosed valleys. People who lived near strong magnetic anomalies adapt differently than those who did not. People who lived in stone cities adapt differently than those who lived in wood. These differences do not make one group superior. They make them specialized. And specialization, once again, does not require mystery. It requires time. Now imagine a population whose built environment reinforced calm, resonance, and spatial harmony. Over generations, their nervous systems would adapt subtly to those conditions. Their architecture and biology would co-evolve, not by intention, by feedback. And then imagine what happens when that environment disappears. When buildings are repurposed. When spaces are subdivided. When silence is replaced with noise. The people adapt again. But something is lost. Not in DNA necessarily, but in expression. And this may explain why certain myths persist across regions. Stories of ancient builders. Stories of people who understood stone. Stories of lost ages of harmony. These myths may not describe literal giants or gods. They may describe difference. Difference exaggerated by time. Difference misunderstood by later cultures. And now, let us touch gently on one of the most emotionally charged ideas connected to Tartary. The idea that people themselves were erased. Not killed, but scattered, assimilated, renamed. History shows us that this happens frequently during periods of rapid expansion. Empires do not always destroy populations. They absorb them. They redefine them. They translate their identities into new categories. And once this happens, continuity breaks. Children grow up with new stories about who they are. Old languages fade. Old meanings become irrelevant. And within a few generations, the original identity survives only as faint traces, songs, customs, unexplained habits. This process does not require malice. It requires administration, paperwork, schooling, law. And when modern observers later search for the people of a vanished region, they find everyone and no one. Because the people did not disappear. They became something else. And this is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Civilizations can vanish without dying. They can dissolve, flowing into the future unnoticed. Now, as your breathing grows deeper, let us consider the role of modern skepticism. Skepticism is healthy. It protects us from fantasy. But skepticism can also become a blindfold when it refuses to examine patterns. When it insists on isolated explanations for interconnected phenomena. The Tartary mystery persists not because evidence is overwhelming, but because questions remain unanswered. Why the clustering of architectural anomalies? Why the sudden shifts in cartographic language? Why the repeated burial of urban layers in the same centuries? Each has explanations. But explanations do not always cancel patterns. Sometimes they sit beside them. And the mind, especially the tired, honest mind, notices this and asks quietly, what if the story is not about a hidden empire? What if it is about a forgotten transition? A transition from one way of inhabiting the world to another, from resonance to combustion, from harmony to extraction, from patience to speed. And what if that transition required forgetting not because the old way was false, but because it was incompatible with the new? This would explain everything without requiring secrecy. No grand council, no single plan, just momentum. History often moves this way. And now, let us return to the image of the buried city one last time. Imagine standing at the edge of a modern street late at night. The noise is minimal. The air is cool. You notice a small metal grate in the pavement. Below it, darkness. You shine a light, and for a moment, you see stone. Old stone. Cut cleanly. Still holding weight. Still doing its job. No plaque explains it. No tour guide points it out. It simply exists. And that is the final lesson of this story. The past does not need recognition to be real. It does not need agreement. It does not need belief. It only needs to remain. And remain it does. Under streets. Under narratives. Under assumptions. The Tartary story endures not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it reminds us of something ordinary and uncomfortable. That history is layered. That progress overwrites as much as it builds. And that forgetting is often the price of moving forward too quickly. As you drift closer to sleep now, let the mystery soften. You do not need to decide what Tartary was. Empire, region, label, metaphor. Perhaps it was all of these at once. Or perhaps it was simply the name we once gave to complexity. And complexity, once simplified, always feels like loss. Let your mind rest with that thought. The world beneath you is older than the stories told about it. And it is patient. Sleep. The layers will still be there when you wake. As the night grows heavier, the mind begins to loosen its grip on certainty. Thoughts no longer arrive in straight lines. They drift. They circle. They return to the same places from different angles, as if searching for something they almost remember. This is where the deepest stories wait. Not in facts alone, but in patterns that refuse to disappear. Because even when civilizations fade, the world does not reset. It carries forward habits, structures, and echoes quiet remnants that survive long after names are forgotten. And perhaps the strangest thing about forgotten civilizations is not how much was destroyed, but how much was left behind. Stone does not vanish easily. Neither does geometry. Neither does human instinct. If you stand in front of certain old structures, those built before modern standards, before steel and concrete, you may notice something subtle. They feel composed, not aggressive, not demanding attention, simply present. They do not overwhelm the senses. They organize them. This quality is difficult to describe in technical language, but easy to feel. Modern spaces often stimulate. Older spaces often regulate. And regulation is powerful. A regulated space slows the heart. It steadies breathing. It narrows attention without force. This is not accidental. Long before psychology existed as a discipline, builders understood the nervous system intuitively. They did not speak of dopamine or cortisol. They spoke of balance. They observed how people behaved in different spaces and adjusted accordingly. And over centuries, those adjustments became tradition. Not written down, not patented, but remembered through repetition. This is the kind of knowledge that disappears first when societies accelerate. Because it cannot be rushed. It cannot be standardized easily. And it does not scale well in systems obsessed with efficiency. Now imagine this knowledge spread across a vast region, not centralized, not unified politically, but shared culturally. A zone where similar architectural instincts emerged again and again, simply because they worked. Where builders learned from builders, not from books. Where form followed experience, not ideology. Such a world would not leave behind a single capital city or monument declaring its dominance. It would leave behind consistency. Patterns repeating across distance. And consistency is harder to notice than spectacle. This is why later historians, trained to look for empires, often miss civilizations that did not organize themselves around conquest. If a culture does not expand violently, it leaves fewer scars. And scars are easier to study than harmony. Now consider what happens when a new system arrives, one that values expansion, extraction, and speed. The old structures are not always destroyed. Often, they are reused, repurposed, renamed. A building designed for gathering becomes administrative. A space meant for resonance becomes storage. A city laid out for balance becomes crowded with new functions it was never designed to support. And slowly, the original intention disappears. Not erased, misunderstood. Future generations look at the same stone and see something else entirely. This is how meaning dies without damage. And this brings us to one of the most unsettling realizations of all. When knowledge is embodied rather than written, it is fragile. Destroy a book, and knowledge can be copied. Destroy a lineage, and knowledge vanishes forever. Wars destroy cities. But modernization destroys lineages. When craft becomes obsolete, apprentices disappear. When machines replace hands, muscle memory fades. When education becomes centralized, local variation is lost. This is why the most profound loss of the modern era is not architectural. It is experiential. We no longer know how it felt to build the way earlier people built. And because we do not know how it felt, we assume it was impossible. This assumption is comforting. It allows us to believe we are superior. But superiority is a dangerous illusion. History does not move upward in a straight line. It moves sideways, trading one set of abilities for another. And every trade has a cost. Now, let us turn again to the idea of burial. Because burial is not always the result of catastrophe. Sometimes, burial is policy. When cities modernize, older layers become inconvenient. They do not match new street grids. They do not fit new infrastructure. They do not align with new standards of sanitation or transport. So they are covered. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are in the way. And once they are covered, curiosity fades. Children grow up unaware that another city exists beneath them. And when awareness is gone, questions stop forming. This is how silence spreads. Not through censorship, through irrelevance. Now imagine this process repeated across dozens of cities, across countries, across continents, each time with a local explanation. A fire here, a flood there, urban renewal somewhere else. Each explanation reasonable, each explanation true. And yet, when seen together, they form a rhythm. A global tempo of erasure, not coordinated, but synchronized by circumstance. And synchronization does not require conspiracy. It requires similar pressures acting on different places at the same time. Industrialization did exactly that. It compressed time. It demanded uniformity. It rewarded speed. And anything that slowed it down, anything that belonged to an older rhythm, was either adapted or buried. Now we arrive at a quieter, more human question. What happens to people in such transitions? The answer, again, is not dramatic. Most people survive. They adapt. They learn new systems. They forget old ones. And forgetting does not feel violent from the inside. It feels practical. Why remember old ways when new ones work? Why hold on to old identities when new ones offer opportunity? This is how entire populations can be transformed without resistance. Not because they are forced, but because the future is persuasive. And when children are raised entirely within the new system, the old system becomes unimaginable. This is the true power of historical transitions. They do not destroy memory directly. They replace the conditions that allow memory to survive. And once those conditions are gone, memory dissolves on its own. This is why the Tartary story refuses to settle. Because it sits at the intersection of architecture, geography, identity, and time. It asks whether something substantial existed before modern categories, and whether those categories erased more than they revealed. It asks whether progress sometimes requires amnesia, and whether that amnesia leaves traces. Because traces do remain. In place names that make no sense anymore. In buildings that do not match their assigned eras. In myths that repeat across cultures that supposedly never met. In a lingering sense that something about the past does not fit neatly into timelines. This sense is not proof, but it is not meaningless either. It is the mind responding to inconsistency. And the human mind is very good at noticing inconsistency, even when it cannot explain it. As you lie listening now, let the idea of Tartary soften. Do not think of it as a lost empire. Think of it as a gap. A space where multiple explanations overlap, but none fully satisfy. A reminder that history is curated. That what we know is shaped by what was convenient to record. And that what was inconvenient often survives only indirectly. In stone, in habit, in the way certain places still feel different. And now, we reach the final resting point of this continuation. Not a conclusion, but a quiet landing. Imagine once more that you are walking through a city at night. The streets are empty. The air is still. You pause at a building that has stood for centuries. You do not know who built it. You do not know what it was originally called. You only know that it remains. And as you stand there, you realize something simple and profound. History does not belong to dates. It belongs to continuity, to what survives long enough to influence the present. And perhaps the true legacy of whatever once existed across those vast lands we called Tartary is not dominance or technology. It is endurance. The ability to leave behind forms that still shape us, even when we no longer know why. That is a legacy more powerful than empires. Let that thought carry you into sleep. No answers are required. Only rest. The past will wait. It always does. As the night reaches its deepest hour, something ancient awakens inside the human mind. Not fear, not excitement, but recognition. The kind that does not arrive as a thought, but as a quiet shift. A sense that the world is older than the stories we tell about it. At this hour, the mind no longer demands proof. It no longer asks for sources or timelines. It listens. And when it listens long enough, it begins to hear something beneath the noise of modern certainty. A low, persistent hum. Not a sound you hear with your ears, but one you feel. Like pressure, like weight, like memory settling into place. This is where the real story begins. Not with maps, not with empires, but with the realization that forgetting is not an accident. It is a function. Human history does not erase randomly. It erases what does not fit the dominant rhythm of the present. Every age selects what it can carry forward, and what it cannot carry, it leaves behind, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally, but always completely. The world before industrial time moved slowly, not because people were incapable of speed, but because speed was not the goal. Life was shaped by seasons, not schedules, by daylight, not artificial hours, by bodily limits, not mechanical endurance. In such a world, architecture was not a commodity. It was an agreement between humans and land, between shelter and climate, between sound and silence. Buildings were not designed to impress strangers. They were designed to last among those who knew them. And when something is built to last, it does not announce itself. It settles. It becomes part of the landscape, like a mountain that no one thinks to question. This is why the oldest structures feel unsettling to modern observers. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are calm. Calm in a way that modern life rarely allows. Their walls do not rush you. Their proportions do not demand attention. Their spaces do not compete. They wait. And waiting is dangerous to systems that require constant movement. Now imagine a vast region larger than any single state, where this philosophy of building was common, not enforced, shared, passed from generation to generation as the correct way. Not because it was sacred, but because it worked. Imagine roads that followed land instead of cutting through it. Cities laid out to breathe rather than dominate. Stone shaped to resonate, not to dazzle. Such a civilization would leave behind no single signature monument. Instead, it would leave behind consistency. And consistency is the hardest thing to erase completely, because it does not rely on one location. It exists everywhere at once. This is why, centuries later, we find familiar forms repeating across enormous distances. Domes that curve with the same logic. Fortifications that obey the same geometry. Civic spaces aligned with the same instincts. Not copied, remembered. And then something changes. Time compresses. The world begins to move faster than the human body evolved to move. Coal replaces muscle. Steam replaces patience. Electricity replaces rhythm. And suddenly, the old world feels inefficient. Its methods too slow. Its values too subtle. Its architecture too heavy. Not heavy in weight but in meaning, because meaning slows people down. So the transition begins. Old structures are not destroyed immediately. They are reinterpreted. A hall designed for resonance becomes ceremonial. A city planned for balance becomes overbuilt. A technique refined over centuries becomes primitive. Words change first. And when words change, perception follows. The past is no longer an alternative. It becomes a prelude. Something inferior that led inevitably to now. And inevitability is the most powerful myth of all. Because if the present was inevitable, then nothing valuable was lost. But the body knows better. The body remembers what it feels like to be calm. And calm is rare now. So when people walk into old spaces and feel something shift inside them, slower breath, quieter thoughts, deeper attention, they do not know how to explain it. So they mythologize it. They speak of lost civilizations, hidden empires, advanced knowledge. But the truth may be simpler and more uncomfortable. The world did not lose superior beings. It lost a compatible rhythm, a way of living that aligned with human limits instead of overriding them. And that loss did not happen in one moment. It happened gradually, then suddenly, like a river redirected. Now let us descend again below the surface. Because the earth itself tells the story when paper does not. Across cities old enough to remember fire, flood, and rebuilding, there is a recurring phenomenon. Lower levels sealed. Windows trapped beneath pavement. Doorways leading into earth. Modern explanations are tidy. Urban elevation. Sanitation improvements. Economic redevelopment. All true. And yet when repeated across continents, across governments, across climates, the effect is the same. The old world sinks. The new world rises. And no one stops to ask whether the sinking was always necessary. Because necessity is often decided after the fact. The buried floors do not protest. They continue to hold weight. And above them, life continues. This is how history disappears without violence. Not by destruction, but by superposition. One layer placed gently on top of another until the lower one becomes irrelevant. And relevance is everything, because humans only remember what they can use. Now imagine a child growing up in such a city. They never see the buried level. They never know it existed. To them, the world begins at the street they walk on. And so the buried city might as well not exist. Multiply this by millions of children, by decades, by education systems that teach only the visible layer. And soon, the past is not hidden. It is unthinkable. This is how civilizations truly vanish. Not when the last building falls, but when the last question stops being asked. And this brings us back inevitably to Tartary, not as an empire, not as a fantasy, but as a question that refuses to disappear. Why did such a vast region once share a name? Why did that name fade precisely when the modern world standardized itself? Why do traces of an older architectural logic persist where that name once stretched across maps? The honest answer is this: we do not know. And that uncertainty is the most threatening thing to authoritative history, because authority depends on closure. Mystery keeps the mind open, and an open mind is difficult to govern. So the story simplifies, and what does not fit is quietly excluded. But exclusion leaves gaps, and gaps attract attention, especially at night, especially when the world is quiet enough to hear what remains unsaid. As the silence deepens, the mind begins to move in a different direction, not forward into explanation, not backward into nostalgia, but inward towards something slower, heavier, and far older than memory itself. Because there is a point, late at night, when curiosity turns into intuition, when the mind stops asking what happened and begins to ask how it felt. And that question changes everything. Imagine a world where the pace of life was set not by clocks, but by light. Where the rising of the sun did not signal urgency, but permission. Where darkness was not something to be defeated, but something to be respected. In such a world, people did not fight time. They lived inside it. They understood, without theory, that speed extracts a price. That rushing fractures attention. That a body pushed too fast forgets how to listen. This understanding shaped everything. It shaped how people walked, how they spoke, how they built. Streets were not carved for maximum throughput. They were shaped for human movement. Buildings were not stacked for profit. They were spaced for breath. Sound was allowed to travel slowly, to soften, to settle. And silence was not empty. It was full of awareness, full of subtle signals the modern world no longer hears. Now imagine this way of life stretched across immense lands, not unified by a flag, not ruled from a single throne, but connected by rhythm, a shared tempo of existence, a shared sense that life was something to be inhabited, not conquered. Such a world would not leave behind a single legend. It would leave behind fragments, pieces that make sense only when viewed together. A dome here, a buried street there, a map that uses a name too large for modern categories. And this is why the story refuses to disappear, because it does not live in one place. It lives between places. Modern history prefers sharp edges, clear beginnings, clear endings, clear winners. But human reality is softer. Transitions blur. Old worlds do not collapse neatly. They dissolve. They thin out. They become quieter until only attentive minds notice their absence. And absence is difficult to prove. You cannot photograph it. You cannot excavate it fully. You can only sense it through contradiction, through moments where the official explanation answers the question, but not the feeling. Why does this building feel older than its date? Why does this city layout feel intentional in a way we no longer design? Why do so many ancient structures appear to have been built with an understanding of human perception that modern design often ignores? These are not accusations. They are observations. And observation is where real inquiry begins. Now let us consider something deeply unsettling, but profoundly human. What if the past we imagine as lost was not lost all at once? What if it faded unevenly? In some places, traditions survived longer. In others, they vanished quickly. This would explain inconsistency. Why some regions feel disconnected from their own history. Why others carry strange continuity beneath new identities. Because cultural erasure is never uniform. It depends on geography, on economics, on pressure. Some places adapt faster because they must. Some hold longer because they can. And in this uneven fading, confusion grows. Later historians, trying to assemble a clean narrative, encounter contradictions. So they smooth them out. They compress. They simplify. They choose the version that fits best. And what does not fit becomes anomaly. An anomaly becomes footnote. A footnote becomes silence. Now think about how often silence is mistaken for emptiness, when in reality, silence is usually the result of something being removed. This is why the Tartary idea is powerful, not because it offers a clean alternative story, but because it highlights the silence. It points to a space where something once existed, something complex enough that reducing it to a paragraph felt easier than explaining it honestly. And complexity is expensive. It takes time to teach. It requires humility to admit. Modern systems do not like complexity. They like efficiency. And efficiency prefers forgetting. Now let us move to an even deeper layer. The body. Because the body remembers things the mind does not. When you enter certain old spaces, your breathing changes. Not consciously. Automatically. Your voice lowers. Your movements slow. This is not imagination. It is response. The nervous system reacting to proportion, material, acoustics. These buildings were not neutral containers. They were environments designed intentionally or intuitively to regulate human state. Modern design rarely prioritizes this. Not because it cannot, but because it does not measure easily. You cannot put calm on a spreadsheet. You cannot monetize resonance quickly. And so it disappears from priorities. But when people sense that something has been lost, they search for explanations. Some turn to fantasy. Some turn to conspiracy. But others simply sit with the discomfort. And discomfort, when allowed, becomes insight. Perhaps the old world was not technologically superior. Perhaps it was psychologically aligned. And that alignment is harder to replace than machines. Now imagine what happens when such alignment is disrupted. People become louder, more restless, more distracted. They adapt, but the cost shows. In anxiety, in constant stimulation, in inability to rest. And suddenly, the old world feels appealing. Not because it was perfect, but because it was slower. And slowness feels luxurious now. This is why sleep history channels resonate so deeply. They are not about facts. They are about tempo. They slow the listener down enough to sense what modern life constantly overrides. And when the tempo slows, the questions that arise are not academic. They are emotional. What did we give up? What did we forget? What ways of being were deemed unnecessary? And here is the most important realization of all. A civilization does not need to be advanced to be valuable. It only needs to be attuned. Attuned to land, to body, to time. And when such attunement disappears, the loss echoes forward. Not as ruins alone, but as longing. A quiet sense that something about the modern world is misaligned. That sense is what drives these stories. Not desire for secrets, but desire for coherence. Now, let us return once more to the image of the buried city, but see it differently this time. Not as evidence of catastrophe, but as evidence of transition. A world layered on top of another. Each layer believing it is complete. Each layer unaware of how provisional it truly is. And somewhere beneath all of them, the earth remains unchanged. patient, unconcerned, holding everything. This is where the story finally rests. Not in revelation, not in exposure, but in acceptance. Acceptance that history is not a straight path. That civilizations rise, overlap, and dissolve. That names disappear, but patterns persist. That what we call lost is often simply absorbed. And that perhaps the greatest mystery is not what was erased, but what continues to shape us even after we have forgotten its name. Let your thoughts slow now. You do not need answers. You only need to feel the depth. The world is older than memory, and deeper than explanation. Sleep. The past is still here, just quieter.